What is dialogue? There is a lot of communication research on the topic of dialogue that notes that dialogue is a key component in creating avenues for communication and participation. The overall approach to dialogue and the increasing trend toward it is a positive one, where dialogue is typically thought of as a positive thing that enables different actors to come together and communicate. In this sense, a dialogic frame to communication is one that engages with the notion that two people or two different stakeholders or two communities come together and engage in mutual participation to create or co-create something new through their participation in the process. Now, a body of culture-centered work has engaged with this notion of dialogue, specifically questioning the generally positive notion of dialogue. The skepticism toward dialogue is driven by the idea that dialogue or terms to dialogue are often used by those in dominant structures, particularly within structures of neoliberal governance, simply to co-opt subaltern participation. So think of an example. There are numerous mining projects across the globe that, for instance, use community building dialogues as ways for co-opting subaltern participation within communities where they seek to build these projects. In these instances, the local agency of communities are constituted within the broader agendas of the organizations that are seeking to build the mining projects, often undermining the basic agency and participatory capacities of communities. The skepticism of dialogue, therefore, attends to the ways in which calls to dialogue are manipulatively used by mainstream dominant structures, using the languages of freedom, liberty, democracy, precisely to conduct anti-democratic agendas, precisely to engage in anti-dialogic goals. In other words, the hypocrisy of dialogue becomes an entry point for engaging and questioning dialogue. In opposition to this idea of dialogue as understood within the mainstream, culture-centered research discusses the idea of dialogue precisely as it relates to the location of dialogue, dialogic calls within the dominant structures and the agendas of these structures. In other words, in my work, I argue that dialogue needs to be understood in terms of the underlying agendas behind the people that are issuing the calls for dialogue. Dialogue needs to be understood in terms of the intentionality that gets written into the calls for dialogue. Dialogue also needs to be understood in terms of the specific outcomes that are played out through dialogue. In other words, let's take back the example of mining projects. If truly mining companies that are engaging with the subaltern sectors in dialogue were to foster dialogue, it would mean that one of the possible outcomes of the dialogue would be that the mining company ceases its operation in a specific subaltern community where the community does not want the mine to be built. Dialogue in this sense therefore refers to this idea of truly opening up spaces within dominant structures to the possibilities of change and structural transformation, rather than co-opting subaltern agency to carry out the agendas of the mainstream dominant structures and their goals and agendas. Let me give you an example of this. A good example is in terms of the area of biopiracy. For instance, in examples of biopiracy, what we often see is that scientists from the developed sector of the world often travel to the underdeveloped sector with an agenda of dialogue, with the agenda of learning, noting that they are going into the subaltern communities to gain and understand subaltern knowledge. However, when they come back, they turn these subaltern knowledges then into the hands of pharmaceutical corporations, which then take that knowledge and patent it in the form of specific patenting rights and ownership rights over specific food products or specific seeds, and in that process then co-opt that subaltern knowledge, turn it into a market commodity, and eventually exhume that knowledge out of the community such that the community itself now has to pay the price to secure the product which used to be a part of the natural lived experience of the community, and which you could say used to be owned by the community in a collective sense. So to resist these notions of dominant dialogues then, CCA engages with the idea of creating impure spaces, dialogue serving as an avenue for impurifying the categories and the ontologies that inhabit the dominant structures. What the notion of impurifying attends to is, if we were to truly engage in dialogue with communities at the margins, the concepts and the constructs that emerge from these margins would disrupt the basic notions of organizing, the basic ontologies and epistemologies that constitute the mainstream. The disruption would happen in such a way that the pure categories of the mainstream would no longer be recognizable. In a couple of subsequent talks, I want to engage further about the processes through which dialogue can serve as an avenue for impurifying mainstream structures.